Hello, I'm Earl Lane, Executive Director of the AAAS Kavli Science Journalism Awards. Welcome to this webinar helping to mark the 75th anniversary of the awards. In 2009, the program, administered by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, was endowed by the Kavli Foundation. And thanks to a doubling of that endowment in 2015, the contest is now global. 4 winners of the award are here to discuss reporting during a pandemic and suggest where science journalism may be headed as we move on toward the centennial of the awards. We'll take a few questions for the panelists later in the program, and this webinar will be posted to our website next week. That's sjawards.AAAS.org. Azeen Ghorayshi of BuzzFeed News is our moderator. She won the award in 2013 as a young writer for the East Bay Express in Oakland, California. She now is science editor of BuzzFeed News. Azeen will also introduce our other panelists. Azeen?
Hi, Earl. Thanks for having me. So yes, I'm really glad to be here today. Like Earl said, I'm Azeen Ghorayshi, and I'll be moderating. We're going to hear a little bit from each of our speakers today and then get to questions. There's also going to be an audience Q&A at the end, so feel free to ask any questions you have there using the Q&A function. So I'll go ahead and introduce our terrific panelists. Joining me is Maggie Koerth, a senior science editor at 538. She previously was a science editor at Boing Boing and monthly columnist for the New York Times Magazine. Also joining me is Angela Saini, a British science journalist, broadcaster, and author of 2 widely acclaimed books, Superior on the Troubling Return of Race Science and Inferior on Science's Treatment of Women. And finally, we have Carl Zimmer, a weekly columnist for the New York Times and author of 13 books on science. Carl is a 3-time winner of the AAAS Kavli Award. So without any further delay, let's get started. We'll be starting off with Carl.
Great, thank you, Azeen, and thank you all for coming. I'm pretty sure that all of us as science writers are having an experience these past 6 months like we've just never seen before. And you know, for my own personal experience, I went back and looked, and over the past 6 months, I've written 36 stories, which is a lot for me. They've been big stories. Some of them have been on the front page of the New York Times. Some of them have been seized upon by the President of the United States. And what makes it particularly weird is that they're all about just one virus. This is not how I used to work. You know, in the months leading up to the pandemic, I might be writing about the Carolina parakeet that's now extinct. I might be writing about ghost lineages of ancient humans. I would write about mind-controlling fungi that would get inside of ants and make them climb up to high places and then sprout their spores out of them. I wasn't at the beck and call of a news cycle. I followed my own curiosity and hoped that I could stimulate the curiosity of my readers. In January, maybe like many science writers, I had a kind of a queasy feeling. I didn't like the news that was coming out of China, especially when they had to close down an entire gigantic city. And then what made me really realize that my own career was about to take a sharp turn was at the end of February. My editor, who would let me write about practically whatever I wanted, said that he was only going to be editing stories about COVID-19. And I thought, wow, that is quite a job. And I said, well, I'm here to help. So I started coming up with ideas about the coronavirus, and you know, that has basically been what I've done ever since, and I'm not sure when that's going to change. A lot of the stories that I've been working on, they've been straight reporting. I mean, I think they're the kind of stories that I might have written not in a pandemic. You know, basic questions like, you know, why does this virus seem to spread through super spreading events? How are scientists making vaccines? But at the times, we have been actually trying out new formats that better suit the moment. And one thing that I believe is that while it's fine to sort of keep, pushing that news cycle, it's also important to stop and just take stock of the fundamentals. I think, the average reader would appreciate if you say, like, you probably are wondering what a virus is. Let me tell you. Let me remind you, how does a virus infect cells? Why does it actually help to wash your hands? And so I've been working with Jonathan Coram, the graphics editor at the Science Times, and we've been sort of combining, straight ahead text with images in a way that I think can better communicate some of these fundamental issues. We also did a piece where we kind of went gene by gene through the virus and talked about what we know about what these 29 genes do. Also, in addition to exploring, what illustration can do, I've been trying to explore other media. So for example, The Daily with Michael Barbaro, I did an interview with them where they basically brought me a lot of questions from kids about the coronavirus. And that is a really good exercise in trying to be clear and to the point. And I could tell that, from the feedback that, actually a lot of parents appreciated some of these answers to basic questions. I also found that standard news sometimes doesn't work so well because there's so much news. And so, for example, with vaccines, I was starting to sort of keep tabs on who was getting involved with vaccines, and my editor would ask me, oh, like, where does this stand? Where does that stand? And I couldn't keep it straight. So I made a spreadsheet, and eventually that spreadsheet evolved into our vaccine tracker, where now we have, it's this morning, I think we updated it to 42 clinical trials. And I also have a extra spreadsheet of like 92 other preclinical active projects. So we find that these kinds of trackers really draw people. It gets huge amounts of traffic every day, and it's been going since June. I think also, we've had to recognize the fact that, we sort of idealize basic science as somehow being sort of insulated from, the impacts of politics or from the disinformation wars. But that's always been a bit naive. And, it's especially naive in the middle of a pandemic. Science, whether people believe a particular finding in science or not, or whether they cherry pick to suit their own ends, that is a huge issue right now. And so we have to engage with that misinformation directly. Sometimes it engages with us. It has been a very weird experience for me to see my stuff being tweeted by the president. I wrote about how after the virus emerged in China and then spread to Europe, New York City, most of the viruses that came into the city in February that created the devastation that followed came from Europe. So then Donald Trump on April 11th said, so the fake news New York Times is tracing the coronavirus origins back to Europe, not China. This is a first. I wonder what the failing New York Times got for this one. And are there named sources? They were recently thrown out of China like dogs and obviously want back in. Sad. Strange. I took the opportunity to respond to him and with a thread. I doubt that he read it, but Twitter tells me that a lot of people, like a couple million people, may have read it, and that's gratifying because I'm trying to get that information out. Ironically, yesterday I just discovered that the president came back for more. I co-authored a piece on the Johnson & Johnson trial, to which he said, big news, numerous great companies are seeing fantastic results. FDA must move quickly. So of course he's taking this news and using it to pressure the FDA to cut corners on their vaccines, which they should not do. Anyway, I just, I think it's, I'm still trying to find some space for the weird science, for the weird news, because it's really very dear to me. And you know, if you when you discover that a big risk factor for COVID is a gene that some people inherited from Neanderthals, I want to write about that. And I think it's really important we don't forget that we don't forget the weird stuff really matters. And I'll just close with one example of that. I mentioned these fungi that make ants climb to the top of plants. Caterpillars can get infected by a virus called the baculovirus. It makes them climb up as well. And then the virus sort of rains out of them onto other caterpillars below. Well, scientists have taken advantage of this virus, which makes these huge protein balls inside of the caterpillar, and they've engineered it so that it will make proteins of whatever kind they want. There's actually a flu vaccine called Flublok made by Sanofi, which uses these zombie viruses in dishes of insect cells. Now, right now, Sanofi is on our tracker because they're using this amazing zombie virus to make a COVID vaccine. And it's starting in clinical trials. And you know, this could be something that you get in your arm 6 months from now. So, you know, we need to show people that, you know, that the weirdness of science might even save their life. So, yeah, so that's been my experience so far. And, you know, I'll be delighted to talk more about it in the discussion section. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Carl. Okay, up next we have Maggie.
Hi. Well, thank you for having me here. I was thinking while Carl was talking about when I knew that coronavirus was going to be a big deal. And I think that the shift for me really happened in early March when I started feeling all of this uncertainty and talking to sources who were suddenly trying to like put a lot of nuance into their responses and who didn't necessarily have answers for things and who were trying to give us these sort of clear, what should people do responses, but were unable to. And, you know, I'm sitting here now 7 months later and have been writing about the epidemiology of this virus and the choices that politicians and people are making about it this whole time. And I still feel all of this uncertainty. You know, let me give you an example. I have 2 daughters. They're 7 and 5. They're in 1st grade and kindergarten. And our school district is all virtual, and there's no apparent plan for what conditions would actually move them back to a classroom. And that's frustrating, but in some ways it's easier because I didn't have to decide whether to put them in a classroom or not, because what's the right choice? Do you keep them home? Do you send them to class? Under what conditions? When do you pull them out? When do you put them back in? What are the consequences? Just all of that stuff is so up in the air because these are situations where both choices could be scientifically valid. Science can tell you how this virus works. It can tell you like the basics of how to prevent the spread. But there's a point where science can't tell you exactly the choice to make because there are multiple right choices with different benefits and different detriments. And this has really been the point where curling up in a tiny ball under the covers and sleeping seems like a really good idea. What I have seen of coronavirus in the work that I have done during this pandemic is that it's a pandemic of a virus, but it's also a pandemic of uncertainty and confusion and extreme amounts of mental discomfort. It spreads like this gray goo over all of our lives. And I've kind of been referring to this as the muddy middle, that there's just this ooze that seeps into everything from the way that we model the virus to how we talk about safety precautions like masks to even like how we count the dead. There's more than one right answer. There's nuance, there's subjectivity, there's no sure thing. One of the really good examples that I ran across about this in my reporting was this difficulty of classifying various activities of daily life by risk level. It's a pretty crucial thing to do because you want to help people navigate this new world. You want to kind of help put a framework to how we're all living, but it's also wildly imprecise and messy. When we did a story about this earlier this summer, looking at some of these different charts that different groups had developed, and we got interested in the topic at 538 because we'd been comparing these charts and saw that some of these things felt contradictory. So for example, we had one chart that put eating outdoors with friends as a low risk activity, and a different chart put together by a different group that was showing backyard barbecues near the upper end of moderately risky. And it wasn't clear to us why. And it turned out that these charts were just the product of surveying experts. They were, in other words, the product of subjective assumptions and cultural expectations. And we found that the chart that was rating outdoor eating with friends was coming from a small group of researchers in the Northeast who were thinking about 1 or 2 people, maybe 5, sitting outside, far distanced from each other. And the chart that was putting backyard barbecues as relatively high risk was coming from a group in Texas that was thinking about a very different kind of event where you have people in 100-degree heat moving indoors and outdoors and hugging each other and being relatively close by in large groups. So science can collect this data, but it can't always correctly predict how people will behave. And that makes it really hard to neatly assess risk. How risky is a thing is not a simple question to answer. It's one that involves a lot of uncertainty. Another really good example of this was the protests and riots that have hit many of these cities across the country this summer. I live in Minneapolis, and I did a lot of reporting around the protests and the riots that happened here while they were going on. And I was out in these crowds with my mask on, kind of assuming that there was going to be a lot of transmission happening. And then there just wasn't. It didn't really turn into any kind of super spreader event. We didn't really have any clusters that were associated with those protests. And now I'm still being asked regularly by our readers about why scientists told people it was okay to go out to protests, but then turned around and told them that it wasn't okay to go to a backyard barbecue, to go out to any other kind of outdoor event. And what this ends up boiling down to basically is that risk assessment, the fact that risk assessment is subjective. You know, these outdoor protests carry risk, but they aren't the riskiest thing you could ever do. Likewise, going to a backyard barbecue carries risk, but it's not the riskiest thing you could ever do. These are things that sort of fall into this muddy middle. And for some people, how you judge whether that's a worthwhile risk to take is going to be very, very different from how other people judge what is a worthwhile risk to take. For the researchers that have been quoted saying protesting is okay, well, for them, that trade-off felt reasonable. So you get these kind of situations which can be all perfectly science-based and reasonable, but also chock full of uncertainty. It's just these situations where no one can tell you exactly what to do and only give you general information to base your decision on. And when the stakes are high, when they're life and death, that can be terrifying. All that decision making is exhausting. Learning to live with uncertainty isn't an easy thing to do. And I've come to the conclusion that for journalists and for the public as a whole, living with that uncertainty is something that makes this pandemic really, really difficult. The one bit of good news in that is that we have found that there is really an appetite and hunger for that nuance. You know, I am still finding myself surprising my editor by the number of people that we can get interested in a story about uncertainty and nuance in pandemic modeling. There's lots of people who want this information, who want to be able to fill in those gaps in their knowledge with something, even if it's just, it depends. We just have to figure out good ways to give it to them.
Cool, thanks so much, Maggie. And finally, we're gonna hear from Angela Saini.
Thanks so much, Azeen. Well, I, like so many science journalists, have had an interesting pandemic, not least because around February, March time, I was traveling a lot all over the world. And I'm fairly certain that on one of those trips, I caught COVID myself. At that point in the UK, there wasn't testing except for people in the worst possible condition in hospital. So I can't know for sure, but I did have many of the symptoms. And as a result, I avoided a lot of COVID coverage because it just panicked me and made me feel much worse, especially in my feverish delirium. When I did start logging back into the real world, what I did notice is the kind of fevered state of pandemic coverage. It really was the only story for a few months. It was on the front pages of everything. And what journalists, obviously everywhere, were doing were picking apart the data and asking, what is the new thing that we can say about this now? And as a result, it was very difficult not to see that there was some sloppiness there. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And also some lazy speculation on the part of physicians and scientists. And the sloppy speculation that alarmed me the most, especially given my background, so I cover race and gender and the science of human difference, was the tendency for some experts to look at the big racial disparities in health that we were seeing, and we were seeing quite enormous disparities in the UK and in the US around April, May time. So large, in fact, that by the end of May in Chicago, 60% of COVID-19 fatalities were reported to be among Black patients, even though Black Americans make up only 30% of the population of Chicago. In the UK, South Asian doctors in particular were making up a large proportion of early deaths. And I saw medical researchers speculating about the possibility of this being genetic, that there was something in Black and brown bodies, something visceral or innate to us that made us more vulnerable to this virus, which was alarming because, as we know from genetics, that is highly unlikely. Race is a social construct. It maps very poorly onto genes. It kind of went against the grain of everything we know about racial disparities in health to even suggest that there could be some kind of genetic explanation here. We know, for example, that Black Americans die of almost everything at higher rates than white Americans. The life expectancy of Black Americans is lower than white Americans. In fact, Black Americans even die of infant mortality at greater rates than white Americans. And we know also that to be a Black American is a socially defined category. You can be a very mixed ancestry and still be defined as Black because of the history of racism in America. So how plausible was it then to assume that this socially defined group could be so genetically disadvantaged that not only will they die of almost everything at greater rates than everyone else, but should a virus come along, they would also be more genetically vulnerable? It just didn't make any sense. And that was the point at which, as a science journalist, I decided to start reporting on this topic. And I'm a freelancer. I write for a number of different outlets. So I was quite selective in who I wanted to write for. And the piece I ended up writing was for The Lancet, which is a medical journal. I really wanted to target the medical community with this information because what I worried was that it was the medical community that was itself perpetuating this myth. So I wrote this piece for The Lancet. It was heavily peer reviewed, I should say, over many layers. And when it came out, there was a mixed response at first. There were doctors who just couldn't believe what I had written, even though, like I said, it had been peer reviewed. But that did change over time. And I think the turning point, in fact, remarkably, given that this is a scientific topic, was the George Floyd murder and Black Lives Matter. When that happened, the whole conversation and narrative around discrimination changed. And there was this outpouring, again, kind of a flood of coverage around racial discrimination that showed that, of course, if racial discrimination exists in society, it will also play out in matters of health. And from that point onwards, it felt like as a journalist trying to communicate this topic, it was more like pushing at an open door rather than pushing at a closed one. So I wrote that piece for The Lancet. In order to get it to different audiences, I also wrote something similar for Prospect magazine, which is a large current affairs magazine here in the UK, and also for The Guardian, which has quite a widespread readership. And since then, I've also been involved in other efforts within academia and within journalism to try and correct these kind of false and problematic narratives around race and health. So The Lancet later this year is coming out with a special issue on race and health, to which I've also contributed, which I think will clarify these issues further and help us look more carefully at the social determinants of health. I've also been giving a lot of talks on that issue to scientists and social scientists. So it was an interesting period of time for me, because I think it proved that misinformation can come in so many different forms. It's not just about deliberate actors or people spreading false facts for whatever reason, political reasons, or unknowingly on social media, but sometimes in the gap that we have between the start of a pandemic and all the data we need to understand that pandemic, there can be a lot of speculation that happens. And in that space for speculation, even scientists can get things wrong. Even scientists can make mistakes and need to revise what they're telling us. And, you know, here in the UK, we had a special meeting recently. I'm on the board of the Association of British Science Writers, and we had a meeting recently with editors, news editors who aren't science journalists themselves, and their verdict, looking back over the last 6 months and how their coverage has been, was surprisingly to not take the word of any one scientist. So at the beginning, I think especially at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of people, news editors included, were looking at scientists for clear information. They didn't always get it, and sometimes they got different verdicts and different ideas from different organizations and people depending on who they spoke to. And what these news editors realized at that point was that scientists do have different views, especially when we don't have all the data yet. And that's an incredibly important lesson, I think, for science journalists and for the media as a whole, to understand that science is not always about clear-cut facts at every point, but that it can be more complicated than that, and that perhaps we need to take the long view when it comes to data, to wait a little while before we decide to speculate on exactly what we're seeing. And for me, I think that's also been the lesson, is that data isn't just important at the time that we receive it, but it changes over time. We still won't have the full measure of this pandemic perhaps for another year or 2 years. We won't know the way in which it operates demographically, which populations are likely to be the hardest hit overall, and how the disease works. And we need to maybe occasionally take a step back and think about how to cover something in which the data is so quickly changing. Thank you.
Thanks all. Okay, so you can all go ahead and join me now. Yeah, thank you for all these thoughtful presentations. I have a bunch of questions for each of you, but I did just want to touch on one thing, which, as all of you alluded to, this news story is unlike certainly anything I think any of us have ever reported on before. It's relentless. The news changes by the minute. There's been a lot of suffering, a lot of anger, a lot of confusion, but then all this tremendous amount of positive energy from the scientific community with new information coming out all the time. All of that stuff adds up to some very tired science journalists. So I just wanted to see, sort of on a scale of 1 to 10, how tired are you guys feeling right now?
Pretty tired.
Yeah, tired. I'd say a 9 since virtual school started, for sure.
Same. I'm recovering. I can't tell whether it's tiredness from work or tiredness from long COVID, to be honest.
Yeah, lots of people are about. So I have some individual questions for you guys. Carl, I want to talk a bit about the vaccine tracker, which I think was such a prescient idea and is now an indispensable resource, I think, for both readers and across newsrooms. Like I probably check it a few times a week. Did you foresee when you first put that together the type of story that the vaccine would become? I feel like there's a lot of magical thinking among people that the vaccine is going to come along and fix things and take us back to normal. Mm-hmm. And then on the flip side, we have a president who's turned it into a very, very politicized issue. He's almost daily making statements about a vaccine coming before the election. Did you know that the vaccine was sort of hurtling in this direction?
Yeah, well, I mean, I had been writing about vaccines for a number of years, and I would talk with people about sort of the vaccine landscape, and they were talking about how we need to get better at making vaccines quickly but safely. How can we support vaccine development so that people don't wait until they absolutely are sure that a vaccine works before they go and build a factory for it? They were very frustrated. There would just be these situations where they would be developing a vaccine for a totally new virus, and then nobody wanted to carry it forward. We had an Ebola vaccine when the West Africa outbreak happened. We had a vaccine already that had gone through a lot of animal testing, but no one had taken it to human testing because it just, the market and priorities didn't lend it to it. So in January, as soon, I was talking with vaccine people, and they're like, yeah, we just saw the genome and we're making our vaccine now. And this was sort of the way that scientists would talk about what was going to happen in the future. Well, this was the future. They were reading a genome sequence, they were making a vaccine, and it wasn't just one team. It was like I say, it was more and more and more and more. I mean, we were, it was amazing by the end of January that there were up to 10 or 20 groups, but yeah. And once I couldn't keep track of it anymore myself, I just thought we'd be filing stories, and I'm sure people reading them being like, wait, no, there's this one, but isn't there another one? So we just thought, well, we don't have to fixate on, one article at a time. Let's just make this a living document.
Did you think that it would become sort of one of the top election stories of the year?
Oh, no, that was weird. Yeah, that was, well, because that's, we shouldn't romanticize the history of vaccines. I mean, if you read Jonas Salk's biography, there was all sorts of politics and media manipulation and all sorts of stuff and bad, really, really bad things happening along the way. So, vaccines have never been some sort of pure saintly story, but yeah, the way that, just having the president say that, well, maybe he won't accept what the FDA comes up with in terms of their new guidelines this week or next, that's unacceptable, and it's not anything that's happened before.
Yeah. So Maggie, both you and Angela mentioned this unignorable, all-consuming problem sometimes for journalists of misinformation during this pandemic. And I think you said that a lot of the conspiracy thinking sort of flourishes in this muddy middle where there is uncertainty and where scientists don't always have clear answers, and some people and some media outlets basically blame them for it. How do we as journalists, as science journalists, better respond to misinformation when, a lot of people in this country are out there who think that, even though 200,000 people have died during the course of this pandemic in the US, that the whole thing is a hoax? How do we respond to misinformation without amplifying it and with getting anything across?
I think one thing so there are a couple of things that I've tried to consider here. Having reported on climate change in the past and other things that kind of are rife with misinformation, I have learned that it's more powerful what people's friends say than what the media says. that what people you identify with say than what the media says. So I think that like one thing that's really important is getting voices into your stories that represent lots of different groups, that represent people that your readers can identify with. So it's not just scientists say, it's this guy who sounds like my uncle says, this guy who reminds me of myself says, you know, like that kind of stuff I think is actually really important. When we did a story on death counts and why it was difficult to get accurate death counts, we decided to tell that story through the lens of someone who had died from COVID and who probably was not going to be counted because of all these circumstances around how he had died. And that decision was made partly to keep it from being too wonky and partly because you need that person to identify with to make the story feel more real and to make the story feel like something that feels true. You need people to have it feel true.
That's great. Angela, I did just want to quickly address the fact that you're no longer on Twitter. I used to really enjoy your tweets, especially your work on race science. But I also saw that the harassment that you went through for reporting on that topic and being a woman of color reporting on that topic. Can you sort of walk us through what that experience taught you about sort of journalism and social media and how you view that in the lens or through the perspective of what's happening right now with things getting even more polarized during the pandemic?
I mean, there were a lot of reasons leading up to me leaving Twitter. I left Facebook already last year. I didn't miss that at all. Twitter was a little bit harder because of the way they make it very addictive, and you notice when you leave, you do think about it. But it was largely because I get a lot of harassment. In fact, when I left, it was the day that Richard Dawkins tweeted an endorsement of my book, and he has a lot of followers, and many of them just rounded on both of us with very, very racist abuse. And I just couldn't block people fast enough. And I thought, this is a point at which I have to leave. And what worries me more than these people who commit this kind of abuse online, because I think they've always been there and they have lots of different platforms to use. What worries me more is that platforms like Twitter do so little about it, even now. And however much they say they're doing, it's far too little to protect not just me, but I know there's so many people who get especially women of color, who get a huge amount of abuse, and it really limits the conversations that we can have as a result. You can't have that debate. But I think more fundamentally, they have, and I know lots of people find them beneficial, and especially they've been so important to Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement. But for me, I feel that they've really made debates and discourse so toxic. They polarize people because, of course, you can't have those nuanced conversations, those gentle conversations that you need to have, that real people have in real life. You don't have them. You get pushed into these binary ways of thinking. You either fully believe this or you either fully believe that. And if you show any kind of equivocation, then you're out of the picture. Nobody wants to know you anymore. And that's not how real conversations work. What's been interesting for me, having been off the platform now for 6 months, is I can feel myself now becoming a more moderate person, oddly. And that probably sounds bizarre because I felt myself to be quite a moderate, reasonable person before. But I think now, I vary what I read, and I read a lot more of mainstream media now that I'm not on social media. And I can understand the ways in which I was being pushed into taking positions which perhaps I wasn't completely comfortable with. So I do urge people to leave. And also, we have to remember these platforms are not representative of how most people think. And the big wake-up call for that was the December general election here in the UK, which, if you were on Twitter, wherever side of the political spectrum you were on, it didn't matter which filter bubble you were in, you would have thought that Labour would have done really well in that election. It was one of the worst elections Labour ever had. And that just goes to show, if you're a journalist, don't expect Twitter to show you what people are thinking, because I don't think it really does.
Yeah. A couple of you touched on this, that there's sort of born out of the pandemic, there's been this hunger for science journalism that like really gets into the nitty gritty of whether it's the basic biology or the uncertainty that Maggie you were talking about. But then there, on the flip side, you know, preprints have been reported on a lot more than before, and there are real reasons for that. That has also come with real problems. I'm curious how you all feel, you know, looking ahead, how the pandemic has sort of changed the job of science journalism, like, and also our readers.
I think that, you know, I think a lot of things will probably like kind of quote unquote go back to normal. Maybe it'll take a couple of years, but I do think that I think we science journalists have kind of we're a lot less fixated on, you know, the paper appearing in a journal as being like the thing, the news item. You know, I've been writing about people who, like, while they're working on stuff and they haven't even written up the results, and then I've come back and written about them again. You know, they're looking for like drug targets for the virus. Come back and write about it when they have a preprint. Came back again, wrote about it when they updated it to write in Nature. It's like it's all science. It's all work. But yeah, I think we're going to be looking much more at preprints regularly, but which means that science journalists in particular really need to up their game at being able to tell the good stuff from the garbage, because there's so much garbage out there. And if it feeds into what you think is your sense of what a hot story is, you're not going to challenge yourself about whether this is good science or not.
I mean, I think it's reiterated for me, and like, you know, this is something that I already felt very strongly, that I don't like making stories around just one study to begin with. I mean, I think it is really interesting to be able to use some of these preprints as part of bigger stories that look at the broader spectrum of what's going on, but pinning an entire story around what one paper says, what one preprint says, you know, it sort of highlights that risk, and it highlights the way that you're kind of inserting certainty into something that doesn't have it by focusing so much on just one perspective.
I mean, I think for me, as far as the general public is concerned, I think they imagine that when something is published, whether it's a preprint or not, if a scientist has written it, that is the truth. There's a new fact out in the world. So you can't stop science journalists from reporting on it, obviously, because we're there to get the stories first. But I think what we need to do is weave into science journalism an understanding that science doesn't work this way, actually, that it is a process, a corrective process, and it takes time. And scientists disagree with each other, of course they do. And you know, pictures change over time. I mean, what's been interesting in this pandemic is that one, we've seen politics and science collide so much. I mean, I don't know what the situation is in the US, but in the UK, there's certainly been tension between the politicians and the scientists, the science experts that they've been holding up, and the politicians keep saying we're following the science, and the scientists have to keep reminding us that we don't know everything yet, and it becomes very very difficult and complicated. But I think more deeply, we need to explain to the public that scientists can't know everything all the time straight away. It's a slow process, and papers get things wrong sometimes. Even published, you know, not preprint papers are retracted quite often, and, you know, mistakes happen. And that's because science is also human, and we need to kind of reduce that big distance that we currently have between these ivory towers and ordinary people.
I just have one last question, then we can get to audience questions as well. So I just wanted to talk a bit about the actual career of science journalism. I mean, the media took a big hit early on in the pandemic in particular. I mean, there were lots of layoffs, lots of local journalism outlets folded. And, you know, at the same time, journalists were under more and more pressure because there's more news to report than ever. So I wanted to hear from all of you, like, what your sense is of, you know, what the people at the top of these mastheads think about the importance of science journalism going forward. Like, do you think there is now now that we've gone through one really bad pandemic, or still are going through one really bad pandemic, do you think there is a recognition that like this is an important part of any newsroom? Uh-oh.
Well, I would just say, you know, as a freelancer, I work for lots of different outlets. What's been disappointing for me over time is that so many full-time staffers have been laid off, so more and more of us are freelancing now. That said, there are so many more outlets for us to work for, so there's no shortage of work, I think, out there, and there is definitely an appetite. There has always been an appetite, I think, for science journalism, even if you don't see it heavily featured in, for example, news programs. But I think maybe there's a recognition now that science reporting isn't just, you know, for the back pages, the fun discoveries, that this is something that's deeply embedded in society and really crucial. It's really crucial to have journalists who can navigate not just science, but how that science interacts with politics and with society and sits in these different environments. Because we need that. That's, you know, the one thing that's missing, I think, is those generalists who can understand science as well as they understand the rest of the world.
That focus on not just what has happened, but what it means, I think is really important. And I think that I have seen more space for that kind of reporting that, you know, when I started reporting, compared to when I started reporting 15 years ago now, I see more outlets having space for stories about how science fits into our lives and how science fits into politics and like what it means for the bigger picture of American society. And that may come at the expense of other kinds of reporting. I don't know that we're getting more science reporting, but there's definitely been more of a shift towards that finding meaning in it.
I hope that we can keep, I hope we can hold on to some of the attention we have. I know that people will just turn away. There's lots of news, you know, we'll see how this election goes, for example. You know, I fear that you know, well, let me put it this way. I am actually pretty optimistic that, you know, by the summer, lots of people will be vaccinated. Not everyone, but, you know, the things will be turning. And then everyone will say like, oh, great, don't have to think about viruses anymore. And then, you know, when we try to like land a story on, you know, the next virus out there in a bat somewhere, or how, you know, the government isn't supporting conservation programs that could keep these ecosystems intact or so, and they'll be like, look, we don't have enough time for that. The Oscars are coming up, you know, like, don't bother us. So I hope that we can hold on to some of that attention that we're enjoying right now.
We have a bunch of questions from readers. One is, which stories do you think were overlooked and got less attention about the pandemic in the last few months? There were a lot of stories.
What I would love to see reported, I'm not doing this myself, but I would love to see reported is the inside backroom conversations that scientists were having with politicians. If anyone's got any insight into that, I mean, there is such curiosity, at least on my part, but I know others too.
Yeah, I mean, we're like, you talked about the vaccine tracker, for example. You know, we're reporting like every day. Like, I mean, when I get off this talk, I have to go back and write another vaccine story. Like, I just finished one yesterday. Like, it's crazy. And I don't have really the perspective to sort of what Angela's talking about sort of like what's the big arc of like the discussions, the negotiations, the politics, the business decisions, and backstabbings and all that. But, you know, there are people who are right now working on books on things like, you know, the vaccine race. And I look forward to those because, you know, they hopefully will have the opportunity to sort of like step back and sort of figure out what the hell happened.
I kind of relatedly, I'm really interested in, I would love to see that kind of insider perspective on how decisions about policy and like risk at like state levels are getting made. Because I have often sort of thought about the conversations that have to go into, you know, like when we stopped having a lockdown, when we started having lockdowns, what our rules are going to be, and just sort of like how politicians are responding to this, because it's not an easy thing to respond to. And what is happening in public is only like this tiny fraction of what's actually going on.
I have a question here from a non-journalist who says, it's hard to filter all the information we're seeing. There must be more for you folks. How do you choose what to pay attention to and what to discard? How do you keep up?
A lot of randomness, a lot of pure randomness. You know, I've been bouncing around between COVID and police brutality and criminology reporting this summer. So I have lost track of the COVID story several times just because I was focused on crime data, and then I'd come back and, you know, 15 things would have happened. A lot of what I have been doing is just reading tons of things and pouncing on whatever happens to seem interesting to me at any given point, and then I go off and briefly become some sort of expert in that one very narrow thing and then forget about it the next week.
Well,
Yeah,
I'm not.
go
Oh,
ahead,
sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm not a daily news reporter, so I don't have the kind of pressure that Carl is probably under to be on top of everything. I can ignore a lot of it, which I do. I still get slightly panicked when I read about COVID stuff after my own illness. But I focus almost entirely on race and health issues since the summer. I haven't really followed very much of everything else, I have to say.
Yeah, I have worked, you know, on my own as a freelancer, you know, searching for my own ideas for a long time. And actually, like, during this COVID experience, like I have been, you know, using Slack and Google with my colleagues at the Times. And, you know, the nice thing about a big newspaper like the Times is like, there are just a bunch of us. And so we can pool what we're reading. So people will just say like, hey, did you see this preprint? Hey, I know you're interested in this. And so we sort of like go through things, and, you know, someone might say like, is this any good? And be like, no, that person's a crank, leave that alone. So we really help each other.
I think that like having the ability to turn it off sometimes has been really valuable, both in terms of like figuring out what actually matters to me and just for sanity's sake.
Okay, and then we have one question from a listener in Indonesia who is asking about COVID fatigue, which actually gets to what you were just talking about, Maggie. That, you know, there is this declining viewership and readership at times that is growing to COVID news. Have you guys seen that? And what is your response to it?
We had, so I would say that, like, you know, when I joined up doing COVID full time, so in March and April, certainly in the United States, was when we were having in places like New York, like just the horrific carnage. And so we were it. I mean, we were the news, and you could see it with the analytics. Certainly with issues like in the wake of George Floyd's murder, there was just things shifted away, the election season heats up and so on. But I don't know, I would actually say that, like, well, you know, I'm sure there's a correlation between the daily cases and the daily readership of COVID news. We have way too many cases in the United States, and people are reading about it. I mean, like I say, like, you know, we're constantly being contacted by, you know, the people at the top of the masthead, like, when's that next thing coming? When's that coming? When's that coming? They want our COVID news because that's what our readers want. So, I mean, I have COVID fatigue, just that I want this pandemic to be over, but I don't think there's a readership COVID fatigue now. I mean, I don't know if Angela and Maggie, if you're having a different experience with it.
I'm not. I don't think I've seen much fatigue for our COVID stories. I have, like, when I think about COVID fatigue, what I think about is what my sources and my friends have told me, of just like being tired of having to think about it every day. But people are still consuming the news about it. I mean, I had to convince my editor to do a follow-up story to our, we had a big piece on how models work and why there's a lot of uncertainty built into the models back in March. And I had to convince my editor to let me do a, like, hey, what's up with models now piece. And he just didn't think people would have any interest in it. And it did really well. And I got all these letters about it because, as exhausted as we are, part of the exhaustion is the not knowing. And so people are still, I think, trying to fill that in.
If someone had said to me in December last year, you will not hear anything about Brexit for the next 6 months, I wouldn't have believed them. That's how the news cycle goes. It's quite remarkable. There will be something that replaces this story. We just don't know what it is yet.
I think in some ways too, in the US, it's absorbed. I mean, it's sort of blended into all the stories. It is the election. It is helped in the fight for racial justice. So, yeah. Okay, and then we have one other question. It's kind of interesting. Do you think clarifications and corrections have become more common during the pandemic, particularly regarding medical and science information? Do you think these corrections are given enough prominence, the same prominence as the original story?
There was, in the Lancet, there was a very prominent one around that drug whose name I can't pronounce, that President Trump was, that's it.
Yeah.
And they retracted that, or there was a correction of some sort, and that actually got a lot of coverage. So I think it was quite responsible reporting on that front, that there was coverage, and then there was also coverage of the change.
I think in that case in particular, there were big questions and potentially some fraud allegations too about the data source, which, you know, obviously we've seen crop up in this too.
Yeah, I think it's really valuable to show how the scientific process works, because what you don't want is for people to say, like, wait a minute, in January you said this about the virus, and now you're saying that about the virus. You know, so you're saying this is a good way to protect ourselves, and now you're saying something totally different. As if scientists are high priests who deliver absolute knowledge, and that knowledge never changes. That's not how science works. And so, so if we can be sort of like, you know, continually engaging with that process, like we've been talking about, we can hopefully like show how these things evolve, you know. And I keep stressing, and I'm going to keep working on it, that, like, you know, with all these vaccines that I'm writing about, like, some of them are going to fail, and they're going to fail big. And we just have to accept that that's part of the process.
I think, like, one of the things we've tried to do, particularly with the issue of, like, masks, do they matter, is to try to do multiple stories that sort of show how science is not a book of facts, it's a process. And there are ways that process gives us answers and ways it doesn't. And we kind of have to make decisions anyway. And I think that coming back and doing multiple stories on the same subject as that consensus changes and why the consensus is changing, I think that's stuff that matters, because that sort of shows that process in action.
So it is 2:00. I just want to thank all of you for attending this. This is a treat for me to be able to hear all your thoughts on this. And thanks for everyone who was watching as well. Just want to let everyone know that the webinar is going to be available for viewing on the sjawards.AAAS.org website within the next few days. So if you want to rewatch anything, check it out there. So thanks so much for attending.
Thanks, Azeen.
Thanks
Thank
for having us.
you. Thanks, everyone.